Hey guys, this is the video lecture for chapter 20, which covers consumer choice theory. So this is all about how the economic theory of how consumers make choices. So as a little bit of an introduction, something to think about as we get into this material. So there's a device that can be implanted near a nerve in a person's abdomen, which transmits electronic impulses to affect satisfaction derived from additional bites of food, and thus the person's decision about how much food to eat. So in this chapter, one of the things we'll be thinking about is, and that you will learn, is that a person must compare the overall level of additional satisfaction, right? So marginal satisfaction, something that we will call marginal utility. They need to compare this additional satisfaction provided by this device, and they need to weigh it against its price, the additional cost of getting it, which is $30,000. So it's a pretty interesting thing to think about. So as we move along, keep this in the back of your mind. So our objectives for this chapter, our learning objectives, are first to be able to distinguish between total and marginal utility. So total utility and marginal utility, and be able to understand how they're related, but how they're also different from one another. And then we also need to be able to discuss why marginal utility or additional utility, which, by the way, utility is just the economist's word for satisfaction, why marginal utility ultimately falls as a person consumes more of something. So that's those are our first learning objectives. Our second learning objective is to explain why a consumer's optimal or best choice of how much to consume entails equalizing marginal utility per dollar across all items that they consume. Okay, and we'll see why that if that's not true, then the consumer is in fact not making an optimal or best decision. Our third learning objective will be to describe the substitution and real income effects of price changes. So when a price changes, it's going to have an effect on the consumer's optimum, and it has two effects, in fact. One is the substitution effect, the other is the real income effect. And then lastly, discuss why bounded rationality and sort of the tenets of behavioral economics may prevent a consumer from reaching their true optimum, although they may get close. All right, so here's our outline for the chapter. We'll first be discussing utility theory, and then moving on from that, we'll talk about how consumers optimize their choices. Then we'll talk about how price changes affect consumer optimum, and then lastly, we'll wrap it up the chapter with a discussion of behavioral economics and consumer choice theory. All right, so did you know that when deciding how much to spend on parents for Mother's Day and Father's Day gifts, the typical U.S. resident spends just over 40% more on mom than they do on dad? So think about that for a second. In fact, why don't we make this the discussion post for this module? Tell us why you think people on average spend more on mom for Mother's Day than they do on dad for Father's Day, and try to think about it in terms of satisfaction. All right, so that's basically, these are the kinds of things that consumer choice theory addresses, right? So in this chapter, we're going to discuss utility analysis, or again, utility basically just means satisfaction, and how economists use it as a way of examining how consumers make choices on things like gifts from mom and dad, among many other things, of course.